So the first thing I did was disassemble the back of the coupe, which was pretty straightforward once I got the nesting box off. The internal supports though were a much more difficult proposition. Luckily I was able to reuse some of the supports, and it was just a case then of lining them all up, so I was able to pop some of them out and just put them in line, knowing that the section underneath was going to be cut out. But to be fair, they didn't all want to come out, and this was a much more difficult problem than I first thought it was going to be. I also hadn't realised quite how much structural support I'd put in. I mean, this was like a house, this side of a coupe. I think it could have taken a direct hit from a bomb, but I managed to get it all off eventually, although I did struggle with one section, so I had to get various tools out to try and take it off because it just wasn't cooperating at all. It was a good time saver though to have all of these pieces of wood already cut to the right size with the pocket holes already in them. It did save quite a lot of time in the build, but the most important thing was to get all those struts in the right place. They didn't need to be there for a sort of structural point of view. It was much more about just getting it in the right order and clearing the space for the nesting box, because as I said in the first video, the nesting box was much enlarged to how the original one was. I then offered up the nesting box to make sure that I'd got the structural supports in exactly the right place on both sides, which I was very pleased to say that I'd managed to do. I just hooked in the support that I needed here, which was the one that the nesting box was going to connect to, and then I was able to work on removing the other structural support, which is right in the way. This was where I encountered my first major problem. So thinking outside the box, I first got the Japanese pool saw to try and take it out, but when that had no success, I resorted to my multi-tool to cut the strip out. Like many of you, I am very conscious that my sort of first go-to is always a power tool when, you know, I've got a garage workshop full of tools that I don't use very much. So I did try to use the saw at first, but obviously when it wasn't going through, I did fall back on the electronic tool to help out. It did also make me realise how incredibly sharp this very cheap Parkside pool saw is. It is incredibly sharp. The blade is very flexible, to be fair, but in terms of the actual sharpness, I couldn't knock it. I did actually take a chunk out of my finger later on when I was using it again. The other thing which I didn't realise at the time was the pieces of board I'd put inside the coupe, I'd actually drilled and screwed it into that middle stanch, so I was never going to get that out. With that now free, I began the process of putting in the insulation, and I did this exactly as I did in my garage workshop when I blocked in the garage door. So I just took my time, made sure I put it in. There were a couple of places where I put sort of one layer, ripped a layer in half and put it sort of on top of each other. But I put it in enough that the sort of the friction or the gravity just held it up without the need for anything else. There's something quite satisfying about this stage, because when it was finished and I had all the insulation in place, it actually looked like I'd really sort of made some progress, which I know sounds weird, but it was actually quite satisfying to get that all in and make sure it was all there and exactly where it should be. So with the insulation in place, I was then able to move on to the sort of breathable fabric, which is going to be my sort of vapor barrier. It's really easy stuff to use, and luckily for me, it was exactly, almost identically the right width that I needed to go across from start to finish. A bit skew with installing it, so I just tidied it up with a Stanley knife at the end when I'd put it across, after I'd stapled it in, of course. The other thing I did, and it's not very clear here, I didn't actually film myself doing it, but the other thing I did was I put some scraps of wood on top of the coupe just so I could keep an eye on or mark out where the vertical struts were for when I want to fix the OSB to them later. So although you can't see it, there are some pieces of wood at the top, so I knew exactly where I wanted to screw down when I attached the OSB. Not sure if you can hear it, but the chickens were absolutely fascinated by this kerfuffle going on, and they actually went in the coop to try and sort of see where the noise was coming from, I think, which was quite interesting. But after I'd got the main cover on, I just went along them with a stapler and just plopped some staples onto the individual structural beams, which would make it a lot easier when I came with a Stanley knife to sort of cut out the frame that was the nesting box. When I'd taken off the offcut, I carefully scored around the wood to cut out the exact size for the nesting box. It wasn't a brilliant, perfect cut, but I really did take my time and try to get it as neat as I could, because obviously I didn't want anything to get in the way of the barrier protecting. The next stage was to measure up for the OSB. I'd got the shiplap already at 180, which is what it was, but I just wanted to be doubly sure it was the right measurement. The next stage was to cut the OSB, which I did very carefully because it's about the same amount of money as gold at the moment would. So I really took my time, and when I got the plunge saw out, I checked it, marked it, made sure I had the guide in exactly the right place so I didn't have any mistaken cuts. And then I got the saw out and I just chopped off the edge. I was lucky in the shape that this was. It was around the right sort of width. I only needed to knock off a little bit at the end, which was quite good for me. Again, I'm going to say it every video I know, but the plunge saw from Parkside, fantastic. I then offered it up, and much to my utter joy, it fitted absolutely perfectly. So I was able to, I'd already pre-drilled it, so I was able to just hook it in place. When I'd hooked the main piece of OSB on, it was just a case then of measuring the two sort of gaps either side, which I thought initially were going to be the same size, but obviously due to the fact the original nesting box wasn't exactly in the middle, they were slightly different sizes. So I just used some of the offcut of OSB from the main sheet that you can see there, and also another piece that I had lying around, which was roughly the right size. So I cut both of those to shape to sort of make either side of the drops, as you can see there. Then it was just a case of hooking them on both sides and making sure that they fit, which they did perfectly. So the next thing I did was to sort of knock together a sort of frame around the edge of where the box was going. I just used some outdoor wood for this, and the point of the frame was twofold. Number one, it was to give me a closer connection to the nesting box, and the second thing was it was going to allow me to make sure that I got the shiplap straight and level in exactly the right position. So I just hooked it together, put some outdoor sealant on the edges, and then I went and popped it onto the outside of the coop, and you'll see it's just been attached in this next piece of footage. And there you can see the frame, and here I'm just offering up the first bit of shiplap, and what I've got is some external sealant, and I'm just putting a bead, a very untidy one as it turns out, along the top of the shiplap, and then just attaching it underneath the roof. The only reason it's there really is to sort of stop any bug infestation more than anything else, and obviously to keep watertight, but the shiplap was butted so far up against the roof I don't think that was an issue. I then just popped in the screws to all the pre-drilled holes on the first piece of shiplap. I then just began the process of pre-drilling all of the other sections of shiplap, and then just offering them up and checking in between with the spirit level to make sure they were right. When I was happy, I just fixed them. The only other thing I did do, which you can't see, is I put a screw in between the shiplap to make sure it was equally spaced out. So I put a screw on either end, which has just given me about 3 or 4 mil gap on the end. I don't think the shiplap's going to move that much, but again, it's just being cautious and making sure that if it does have a lot of moisture in it, that there's somewhere for it to expand to, rather than it being so tight that the only option is to push away from the OSB. For the last one, obviously that gap is smaller than, or narrower than a piece of shiplap, so what I did was I offered one up into the groove and slid it along and marked exactly how big it needed to be, and I did the same on the other side, and that gave me an accurate measurement of where it needs to be. Now that line wasn't straight. When I actually measured it, it was sort of bigger one end than the other, because obviously the whole thing's not level, but what it did mean was it was level with the frame and completely nested in, but not necessarily level in terms of measurements either side. So I took the shiplap to the table saw, ran it through, and actually it was pretty much straight. It was about 7 or 8 mil out, I think, on one side. When I was happy, I then offered it up, and it was a little bit difficult because obviously it's got the groove cut in it that I had cut in earlier, which wasn't 100% level. So I'm not going to lie, it did need a bit of persuasion. So I got the Thor hammer out and just tapped it into place, which actually gave me a really, really nice fit. I mean, that piece of wood isn't going anywhere at all. So the whole section all the way down from the top to the frame was finished. It was all straight, as in it was aligned, and I was very, very happy with the progress that I've made so far. And it also gave me the two sections to do, and luckily I've amassed quite a few offcuts of the shiplap, so I've had plenty of wood left to do that. The only thing is the wood wasn't treated. It was then just a case of hooking each piece of pre-drilled shiplap on one after the other, and what I did in between every piece is just check the measurements to make sure that the width of the piece of shiplap was exactly the right size. And I have to be honest, I was really pleased that it was, with the exception of one piece, because of the way that I'd cut the OSB that was slightly out. It was pretty much all a perfect match. So I just hooked them in, again, put the screw in. You might see me sort of looking like I'm drilling from the side, and that's only to sort of pull the screw out where I put it in as the spacer, and it was under a bit too much tension. But soon enough, all the sections on the right hand side were covered in shiplap, and I was ready to move on to the left hand side. Obviously the pieces of wood on the left hand side were a lot smaller. So the next thing I did was switch to the other side, and as you'll see, I got a bit braver here. After putting the initial piece in and getting that right, I then cut all of the other pieces to size, and they were exactly the right size. So I was able to set up a stop block on the miter saw. Then I just cut them all to size, pre-drilled them all, and then just offered them up and put them in one at a time. And I was very pleased to say, A, they're all the right size, and B, they're all the right length. By the time they had the spacers in them, they matched perfectly and fitted in with the bottom of the frame that I'd put on. So very happy with how that looked. The only thing obviously left is the finish, and this whole outside back of the coupe is going to get another finish of grey paint when I'm able to get some. I then cut a piece of the wood that I had lying around. This is the packing stuff for the worktops that I got from a very well-known store. Cut that down on the table saw to get the right width, and then I used some edging strip which I had lying around the garage workshop, just to put it, because obviously it's essentially MDF in the middle. So I just put a little barrier by putting an edging strip all around the outside and both sides. I just cut a very simple mitre in it so that it all matched up, and it's more about sort of stopping the moisture getting in rather than anything else. And again, this is all going to be covered in wood treatment anyway, so it's not as important. I then cut on the table saw at a 45-degree angle a little, what I'm going to refer to as a rain strip, that's just going to sit above the lid of the nesting box, just to sort of deflect the rain really. So I just got a piece of pallet wood that I had lying around, which was exactly the right size, and I ran it through the table saw to get a sort of 45-degree bevel, a bit like when you're making a French cleat really. And then when it was finished, I just drilled 4 holes in it just to attach it. Again, this is all going to be sealed and treated, so the water won't ingress anywhere. I was very, very careful, and I don't know if you can see from the look of my face now, I was very, very careful using the table saw for this cut, because pallet wood is actually really very strong. I didn't want any movement, but as you can see, there was a nice angle cut in it, which would allow me to sort of deflect the rain. You can just see the cut in the wood there. I then jumped on the bandsaw and got a piece of wood. This is actually an offcut from the bottom of the nesting box, and just cut it on an angle, almost like a sort of door wedge. And this is just to sit on the top of the nesting box, just to angle the roof down slightly so that water doesn't pool, and any water that gathers or comes off of the rain shield will just have the opportunity to run off, because obviously the top surface, that Formica surface, is completely waterproof, so any water that goes on it will just slide straight down off it, and off it goes. And again, as I mentioned in a previous video, I'm really trying to use my bandsaw and my other tools that aren't getting used as much. I could have done this on a number of other tools, but I really need to practice with the bandsaw, so I took my time, and I was really pleased with the overall quality of the cuts at the end. I think the more I use this tool, definitely the better that I'm getting on it, and hopefully long may that continue. The next stage was just to glue them on, which I did. I just used some normal wood glue for this, and I put them on and then just got some clamps. I'm not going to drill or screw them. I don't really want to do that, to be honest with you. I might put a pin in them, depending, but to be honest, when they stuck on and I clamped them on, that glue is really good, and it did go, it went off really, really quickly. So I'm comfortable they're going to be okay. I glued this one, and then obviously I glued the one on the other side in exactly the same way. I then attached the rain hood, which was a little bit trickier than it looks, because at first I got it level, but then one side was significantly above the lid of the nesting box. So when I sort of got it in line with the nesting box, it wasn't level. But to be honest, it looks good and it looks level, which is the most important thing. The fact it's not, you know, level, I don't think is really a key issue, to be honest. Hello fellow woodworkers, and we've come to the end of the second video in this series on a chicken coop. Now, I know not many of you have got chicken coops lying around, I'm sure you haven't, but the whole point of this series was to introduce some techniques that you could apply to other situations, and you can tell the chickens really love it. So overall, I'm really pleased with how it's turned out. Obviously there's a few things still to do. I've ordered some paint and I'm waiting for that to come before I finish. I also want to go around and fill in all of the screw holes on the shiplap here, and I'm going to cover the whole thing in a water resistant repellent because I want it all to be as completely water resistant as possible. But overall, I'm happy with the way it looks. And if you've watched both videos in the series, if you haven't, go and have a look at video number 1. I'll put a link up there to it. But overall, really happy. There's a lot of new techniques I've used. I've tried to rely less on power tools, although I've used the table saw quite a lot in this series. I've also used my Japanese pull saw and different things. So overall, very happy. I know it's going to keep the chickens warmer, and I also know that it's going to be a lot sturdier and a lot better than the panel wood that I had on there before, which just came from pallets, to be honest. So a brilliant outcome for me. I'm really pleased with how it looks. If it's your first time at the Garage Workshop, please can I ask you to subscribe and like and comment. It really helps improve the channel if you do that. We're slowly creeping to 500 subscribers now, and it would be great to hit that number. If you're a regular viewer, I just want to take a minute to say thank you so much. There are some people that comment on every single video, and A, it's nice to get the feedback, and B, it's really nice to know that people are watching the videos and potentially using some of the techniques that you see in them. I hope you all have a fantastic week, and I'll catch you up on next week's video. Goodbye, fellow woodworkers.